Very welcome. And welcome everybody else to this last research seminar of this rather unusual year. And of course, given as unusual, we have it now very much online. And I'm very happy to have Anna Lührmann here, who is an associate professor at Gothenburg University, docent, as we call it in Swedish, or privatdocent, if you want to speak it do it in German. And she's also the deputy director of the very big project and Institute of Varieties of Democracy, that where Untitled Lindberg is the director, who has been here giving talks before. And Anna received her PhD in 2015 from the Humboldt University in Berlin, with a thesis on United Nations electoral assistant. And she has published a number of papers, a great number of papers, on using a lot of the sources from VDEM in 2019 on autocratization surges, together with Untitled Lindberg, constraining government, new indices of vertical, horizontal, and diagonal accountability. Of course, that's what we are hoping you will talk about today, or you're going to talk about walking the talk. Which parties threaten democracy? So the floor is yours, Anna.
Well, thank you so much. It's such a pleasure being with you, albeit only virtually. I would have loved to come to Stockholm, but I guess in this stage of the pandemic, we better not do this. So, yeah, indeed, today I'm going to basically give you an overview of where I'm currently working at, based on the VDEM data and all our effort to better understand why and how some democracies erode actually these days. So I've prepared a presentation. I will take you through it. It will probably take around 40 minutes. I will present it from my screen, where I won't be able to see you, but if you want to interrupt me with a question, feel free. But you have to basically say something. So I'll share my screen now. One second. Just have to find the right file. Here we go. All right. Can you see the presentation well?
Yes. Yes, we can see it.
Yes. Great.
Very well.
All right. So walking the talk, how to identify anti-pluralist parties. You see that we've already narrowed down the research question a bit compared to what I gave to you when I submitted my abstract. So basically, what the puzzle that we're trying to address in this new paper and this new research comes from our research at the VDEM Institute over the last years. If you've heard a presentation from Untitled Lindberg, I'm sure he's talked about our democracy reports, where for the last 5 years we have found that we are in a process of what we call autocratization. That means basically that we see the opposite trend of democratization happening now in many, many countries around the world. That means these countries become less democratic, either gradually, so it can be like democracies eroding, like in Poland or like in the United States, for instance, or it can be a democratic breakdown, like we've seen in Turkey or in Russia, for example. So this is a trend that we're seeing, and we illustrate that often with our Liberal Democracy Index. I'm sure most of you are familiar with the work we're doing at the VDEM Institute. We work with more than 3,000 country experts to get these assessments about the quality of democracy around the world. And one of our main products is this Liberal Democracy Index that we aggregate these assessments to. And here, if you focus on the thick black line in the center, this gives you the global average of liberal democracy in the world, weighted by population, because we think that this says more about sort of the average experience that the global citizens have of how democratic their country is. And yeah, you see basically that this global average has improved a lot in the 90s. Obviously, this was the third wave of democratization. You see this sharp increase in Eastern Europe and Central Asia. And then somewhat a decline here in Latin America and the Caribbean, where notably in recent years also in Northern America and well, it's mainly Northern America, and this sort of causes the global average then also to go down in recent years. And this graph gives you an overview of the countries that are affected. So the countries that are below the diagonal line are the countries that where democracy has declined. The countries above the diagonal line is where it has improved. You see Tunisia, Armenia, those were sort of the two big cases where we've seen some advances in democratization in recent years. And then you see declines in the United States under Trump. These are particularly declines in informal aspects of democracy, like respect for the Constitution, harassment of journalists, and the such. And you see also declines in Brazil, not only under Bolsonaro, but also before, when clearly the interinstitutional cooperation didn't work out so well in recent years. And also here in the Eastern European cases of Poland and Hungary, that I'm sure all of you have heard a lot about, how, for example, in Hungary, the media is now centralized in a foundation that is close to the ruling party. And then also India, a case that we worry a lot about, because under the nationalistic government here, really minorities have been treated badly. The legislature now has been adjourned for a large part of the corona pandemic. It now only recently got back into session, and these are worrisome developments. Then you also see here countries like Turkey, Venezuela, where this autocratization process has advanced so much in recent years that those countries are not clearly not democratic anymore. So this is what's happening. The share of the world population living in autocratizing countries, living in countries where democracy has declined in the last 10 years, has increased to 1/3 of the world population. So 1/3 of the world population is affected by this phenomenon of autocratization. Now I start basically with this current paper that we're working on, Lührmann and Lindberg and I, and also our colleague Juraj Medikovsky, who is amazing with some of the graphs that I'm going to show you later. Basically, this is the starting point for this paper, that we see these autocratization processes happening in a lot of countries, and that these autocratization processes actually take place by elected incumbents. So it's not like the processes that we've seen in the 80s, for example, in the 90s, and particularly in the, well, 90s is a wrong thing, in the 80s, and particularly in the 50s and 70s of the last century, where a military coup removed elected leaders, and then think about Pinochet, for example, and then autocratization happened in South Greece. Those cases, this is not what we're seeing. What we're seeing right now is that leaders are elected, Putin, Erdogan, Orban, that are elected, and then gradually undermine the democratic institutions, constrain the freedom of the media, limit their accountability towards the parliament, towards the judiciary. In Poland, for example, when they replaced a lot of judges with judges that are close to the ruling party, and also changing of electoral laws to make sure that they win in the next elections. So this is what we're seeing, this autocratization by elected leaders, and we've also shown in other research that once this autocratization starts, it's very, very difficult to stop. Only 80% of the autocratization cases since we started looking at VDEM data, only 80% of the cases have ever been stopped. So we really need an early warning system. We need some indications for what kind of political leaders are actually likely to erode democracy once they come to power. this is what we need. And here we focus on political parties because these political parties are the sort of social groups that bring these leaders to power, that exhibit certain characteristics already before an election that can allow the voters to make judgments on how likely it is that they're going to erode democracy once they are in power. And the problem is, of course, that none of these leaders goes to a campaign and says, hey, if you elect me, I will make sure that you will not have the chance to vote again, right? This is not what they're doing. What they're doing instead, they're even claiming that they actually want to improve democracy, they often have this populist narrative of being anti the corrupt elites, of actually wanting to properly represent the people. So they have a homogeneous understanding of the people. So what is actually the trait of these parties that we can identify that helps us to sort of make a warning signal of how likely they are to erode democracy in the future? And of course, I mean, I already spoke a little bit about populism. That could be like one of the candidates. But the problem with populism is, first of all, that populism is such an ambiguous concept, that even more ambiguous than democracy, very contested. So it's not really clear, like if we talk about populism, what we actually mean by it. Of course, in a paper like this, I can write my definition, right? But learning from Sartori, I think it's always very important that we use definitions as social scientists that actually sort of reflect the definitions and the understandings that are out there in the general public. And when we think about what people think when they hear the term populism, I think for a lot of, particularly those people that vote for these kind of parties, it actually means something positive, because sort of these parties are representing the popular will, right? And then often it's just sort of conceived in a very narrow form that these populists use some narrative of representing the people and of being critical towards the elites, which as such is not necessarily a problem for democracy, because for democracy, I mean, it's ruled by the people, right? And then also being critical of elites per se is nothing that leads a party or ruler to erode democracy. So the problematic issue when it comes to populism is that actually a lot of the populists, when they speak about the people, they actually do so in an anti-pluralist way, right? They suggest that there's something like a general will in the population that they are embodying, that they are representing. So they don't acknowledge that actually the population consists of many, many different people that have divergent interests, divergent views, and that in order to know these views, we have to have sort of a competition of critical ideas. We have to allow these ideas to be formulated in a free press and with freedom of association. And this is the problematic aspect of populism, the anti-pluralist nature of many populists. Now, many social scientists, for example, Jan Werner Müller, philosopher who I respect very much for his work on populism, he would say that a defining feature of populists is that they are anti-pluralists. But that's not really sort of what the common understanding of the term is. And that's why we refrain sort of from saying, okay, populism could be the problem. The other issue is, of course, extremism. We have a lot of work on far-right parties, for example, that are far-right in a cultural sense, that can erode or can be more likely to erode democracy once they get to power. The same thing also is applies for far-left parties in an economic sense, so parties that want to transfer towards sort of a more communist system. We also have studies that link that to the erosion of democracy, but But still, it's not a linear process. So it's not sort of, you cannot say the more left you are, the more likely you are to erode democracy, or the more right a party is. But it always, it becomes problematic when a party exhibits a sort of a at all costs approach, right? And they want to achieve their ideological aims, the aim of staying in power at all costs without respecting democratic institutions. And therefore, we suggest that we are better off if we actually focus on this part of identity of a political party, the anti-pluralism, so that they don't respect the idea that there's no unified will of a population, that we need freedom of expression, freedom of association, and divergent interest groups, and then also that they are willing to respect the democratic norms, even though they might stand in their way of achieving their aims of staying in power or their ideological aims. So this is the main argument here in this paper, and we build on a very famous work by Linz here of 1978, who's written a very, very famous book on the breakdown of democracy back then. And he already developed something like a litmus test about identifying the loyalty, what you call loyalty of political parties or political actors to the democratic process. And he says that there are four indicators here of this litmus test: the unwillingness to commit to the legal means for gaining power, the denial of the legitimacy of democratic political parties to participate in the political process, the unwillingness to reject the use of force, and on the contrary, to ask for the armed forces, and also that they are willing to curtail the civilities of other democratic parties or their supporters. So especially these four indicators of this litmus test. And these ideas have gained prominence now in recent years in this famous book from Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt that have featured this litmus test and come up with some more detailed indicators for this. If you recognize Trump here in these indicators, that's no coincidence, I think. So that an actor expresses a willingness to violate the Constitution, expresses sympathy for non-constitutional means of accessing power, attempts to undermine the legitimacy of elections, right? They wrote that in 2018. Describes rivals as subversive, has ties to armed gangs, or endorses or praises political violence. Yeah? And then also supports or threatens actions against opponents. And this, what we've done now in a major new project is that we've, for the first time, collected data on these four indicators of the commitment or of the lacking commitment to democratic norms. And I'll show you that in more detail in a second. So what we're basically saying, building on this hypothesis that the more anti-pluralist a political party appears before coming to power, the greater the probability that a substantial autocratization process, right, the decline of democratic traits, starts once the party has assumed office. Yeah? So anti-pluralism before coming to power, showing signals of that, is a predictor. It's like is sort of like a canary in the coal mine. Is an early warning signal, not an indication, but like an early warning signal that this is likely to happen then afterwards. And what we've done now, as I said, for the first time, we've collected data on this. So we started with the support of the Wetenschapsraad. We started the Varieties of Party Identity and Organization project. My first big data collection project that I oversaw. So we worked with 665 country experts and managed to capture all parties with a vote share of more than 5% in legislative election across 169 countries. So this is really massive. We have in total 6,300, more than 6,300 party election year units. So it's really big. And typically we have at least 4 experts contributing to each question. And if you have worked with DDM before, you know that we have a custom designed IRT model that helps us to address possible between expert differences in scale use and other problematic issues when working with experts. So this is the party data set. And now we've operationalized this litmus test from Linz in the following way. We capture the low commitment to the democratic process, not the explicit low commitment, with a question that taps into here the commitment of the leadership of the political party to free and fair elections with multiple parties. And we weigh this now in an index, we weigh this higher because this is sort of the explicit commitment. So if that's not even there, then we really know the party lacks this trait. And we've also captured here 3 sort of a bit more implicit indicators of lacking commitment to democratic norms. One is the demonization of political opponents and the use of severe personal attacks. And this is something where we have, which we weigh lower a little bit, because you have some political contexts around the world where this is quite common, the UK, for example. So we've weighted that a little bit lower. And then we have the respect for minority rights and the encouragement of political violence as a 4th indicator. Yeah, so this is our operationalization. And here you see sort of the threats ranging from, for example, here Labour Party in 2019 and some other parties here sort of on the pluralist side. Via the Law and Justice Party before they came to power, they were quite in the center. The Republican Party in the US in 2016 here, and then going to like really extremist parties like Golden Dawn in Greece, or the Venezuelan ruling party.
Sorry, Anna, can you explain the graph that you showed? It was a bit complicated. So what are you showing here? What are we seeing on the different axes?
So this is basically, this is basically just a univariate graph of the anti-pluralism index, right? So it's an aggregation of these four indicators that I just introduced, and it ranges from 0, which means pluralist, to 1 anti-pluralist. And the blue shading here is simply the histogram. So it counts how many observations you have on this particular point of the scale, and this shows sort of where the parties are located. But yeah, I'll have, so it basically really shows that like the very authoritarian, the very anti-democratic parties are really on the top end of the scale, and more democratic parties are to this end. That's basically all the information. And then also most of the parties can be found here on this end of the scale, on the pluralist, on the democratic end of the scale. Now that's basically what I show. Here's another way of looking at the data that I think gives a lot of face validity. The graph on the top only shows ruling parties in democracies, the smoothed median here on this anti-pluralism scale. And as we would expect in democracies, the smoothed median in general is very low, but it has increased a bit over recent years due to this trend, I would argue, of autocratization, because some ruling parties in democracies now are less committed to democratic norms than they were before. And the dots here give you individual observations, and we have also colored it by the economic dimension of the party system. So the left is colored in orange here, the right is colored in pink or red, and you see that basically this issue cuts through the left-right dimension of the party system. I'll have another graph where this becomes even clearer. And also in autocracies, so countries that don't fulfill democratic standards, obviously the median ruling party is also displays these autocratic traits. In the 80s and 90s, basically all ruling parties in autocracies have been here on the high end, on the anti-pluralist end of the scale. And then this has opened up a tiny bit over the last 20 years. Those of you that are political scientists are well familiar probably with this whole debate on electoral authoritarianism. That means that now also in most autocracies, think about Russia, for example, instead of having like a single party communist regime, now we have Putin that at least allows for multi-party elections, but severely constrains them. So this is displayed here in sort of a slow median improvement of the scale in the sense that has become less anti-pluralist. So this is the overall global trend. Now, this is a graph that Uri, my co-author, has made, and that we're all very proud of because it has made it, has been printed in The Guardian, in CNN, and The Economist, a similar version recently. So this is really a graph that attracted a lot of attention now prior to the US elections. And what you see here basically is on the x-axis, you see how the parties are placed in terms of the economic left-right dimension. You see Labour here on the left. You see the PP in Spain or the CDU in Germany on the right. And the Democrats also sort of center-left, the Republicans center-right. And now the interesting thing here is on the y-axis, which is our anti-pluralism or illiberalism index. I will come to that at the end of my talk. We're still debating a bit of whether we label this anti-pluralism or illiberalism. I'll get to that at the end. So these are very, very similar concepts. And what you basically see here that on this dimension that is problematic for democracies, the Republican Party has increased quite dramatically since Trump took over and ran for elections in 2016. It is now somewhere close to the Fidesz party in Hungary, also the BJP in India, that is also pushing India in a more autocratic dimension. And you see that the Republicans basically on this dimension of the party system stayed very, very similar. They have shifted a bit on what we also measure the cultural dimension of the party system, but that maybe will be a bit too much for today's talk. So this is what we've seen in the US mainly, and we also see that we have what we call here the illiberal or anti-pluralist left. So you also have ruling parties in Venezuela, in Ecuador in 2017, and then also here this is the ruling party in Bolivia in 2019, where there were all these problems with irregularities in the elections. I think now in the recent elections, where the same party came to power again, it was a bit different. But this is the 2019 data point. So so this is sort of the development that we see here in the United States. We also see this in other countries that are autocratizing, that have autocratized. For example, here's PiS in Poland. First of all, PiS had a very interesting development also in terms of the economic left-right dimension. They started out sort of as a super centrist party and then have adopted increasingly redistributive policies. So they moved here, our coders moved them a bit to the left. But they've also become quite illiberal, anti-pluralist in several ways, which is reflected here in the data. Same with Fidesz in Hungary. I've already brought some examples earlier. I think this is should be clear to everyone by now. Also Erdogan in Turkey, similar development, and the BJP in India as well. And I think this also speaks to the ability of our coders to differentiate between what a party is doing through the time of through their lifespan or their time in power and what they've done before, right? So they have coded these parties as fairly adhering to democratic norms at the beginning of this century, and then gave us the trajectory of how they've developed. And I think most of these developments we can really back up with also case evidence. So that's quite clear here. Yeah. Now again here one of these graphs from our measure of populism. As I said before, we're trying to just use a very narrow measure of populism because we've taken the anti-pluralist part of populism out here. So we just talk about anti-elitism and citizen-centrism, and we say that there's limited substitutability, so we aggregate it using the harmonic mean. And this is what you see how this plays out with also the Just Development Party in Turkey being more on the populist end, and parties like the Free Democratic Party in Germany being more on the non-populist end of the scale. Again here, I think this is really important to make this distinction. Looking at the US case, we have populism on the x-axis and illiberalism on the y-axis. And we basically see that, yes, also the Republican Party has moved more populist already here in this time, 2010, 12. This was around the time when the Tea Party was gained prominence, or around this time. But then the problematic shift is then in this illiberal dimension that mainly was driven by the time from this 2016 campaign, the first Trump campaign. And also here, the Democratic Party has now shifted a bit more in the populist direction after the Clinton campaign, but not in the illiberal dimension. Yeah, it's the other parties. And then we have a measure also of the cultural dimension of the party system. Those of you that are a bit more familiar with the study of party systems might know that we speak now not only of parties being on the left-right scale in terms of the economic issues, but also in terms of cultural issues on sort of the second dimension or cultural dimension of the party system. This is often being called Galtan, so green, alternative, libertarian on the left end, and traditional, authoritarian, and nationalistic on the right end of the scale. We have operationalized this using 5 indicators on immigration, on LGBT, social equality, on cultural superiority, on religious principles, and on working women. This shows sort of here the Green parties very much on the left end of the spectrum, and far right parties, also the Republican Party, quite on the right side of the spectrum, as one would expect. And then we have the economic left-right dimension that I've already talked about, that I think also plays out quite well. Also, what's important to note is that the economic and the cultural liberal dimension don't capture the same thing. So we see a lot of variance here when we look at the scatter plot. So I think it's very important to note, to measure this really as a two-dimensional concept. All right, now I finally get to the empirical results of all this. We use generalized additive models, and of course several controls as well for other parts of the political process. So the liberal constraints on the executive, also for the economic development, and also for a time trend. And these are the results. Now, these models are probably not, a lot of you are not very familiar with how to interpret these graphs. So I'll really take you through them slowly. So we're looking here in terms of the scope only at newly governing parties. So it's 380 cases about from 1970 to 2019. And remember, the hypothesis is, the idea is that the parties are more likely to exhibit these anti-pluralist traits before the election, and then the more they exhibit the anti-pluralist traits before the elections, the more likely they are to actually start an autocratization process in the year after the election. Yeah, so the coders have always been asked to think about the time period before an election, and now we measure this autocratization as a dummy variable for the year after the election. And you can see here sort of a single cross-sectional correlation on the left side of the plot, and you see that indeed these are all the 4 different indicators of anti-pluralism separately. So lacking commitment to the democratic process indeed has a very steep slope with the relationship to the probability of autocratization. Similarly, but not as steep, the disrespect for minority rights, demonization of opponents, and the acceptance of political violence. And now this already as such for like the basic idea of the litmus test, right, which is about this idea of a canary in the coal mine. So if you see this indicator before an election, you should expect something to happen after the election, not necessarily not saying anything about causality or the such, but just that it's there. So already this simple bivariate correlations would be enough to satisfy that idea. But of course, we also want to look a bit into if we can really say something also about that there might be an effect of these parties then being more likely to start an autocratization process than other parties, and therefore we also use models with multiple with all these variables in there at the same time, and then also the control variables. And here you see sort of the indicator that performs the strongest is the explicit lacking commitment to the democratic process. So parties really challenging the democratic norms already before they come to power. So this is clearly a very strong warning signal. Now, if we look at the index, this is here on the top, the very top row. And now this is one of the advantages of doing this virtually, because you can zoom in on your screen yourself and really look at it better than if I would present this now in a big room and you would be standing there and not being able to really see those plots. So you see here the anti-pluralism on top, then populism, then the cultural dimension and the economic left-right dimension. And in the models with all these variables included, the anti-pluralist index clearly performs strongest and has the strongest relationship to autocratization in the year after elections. When we see in the models with just a cross-sectional correlation, we see also some relationship with the cultural dimension. So the more right parties are on the cultural scale, that seems to be related or correlated a bit to autocratization. The same with economic extremism on the left and on the right, but this basically goes here into the almost out of sample range there. So, yeah. So, but what is clear is there seems to be something to it, that anti-pluralist rhetoric before an election seems to be a good early warning indicator for future autocratizers. So they are basically walking the talk, right? So we shouldn't we should take it as face value what they're suggesting when they're encouraging violence before an election or when they raise doubts about democratic processes. And yeah, so this is basically the finding here. The big open issues that we still have, because this is work in progress, is now if we should frame this as illiberal political parties, as we've done in the first release of this data that was picked up by a lot of media around the world, or as anti-pluralist parties. The problem with the notion of illiberalism is, first of all, I initially was very fond of it because this is really what these parties are doing. They are challenging the liberal components of the democratic process. they are disrespecting the civil liberties, they're disrespecting the rule of law, right? The problem with the term illiberalism, though, is that liberalism, as you all know, is such a broad concept that also has the economic dimension, and that also, particularly in the American sphere, is on the US-American sphere, liberal is often synonymous with progressive or leftist. So we actually had a bit of confusion about this index in that sphere. That's why we're exploring now the term anti-pluralist, which is a bit more narrow and probably easier to understand what we actually are after here. And then we have to add additional controls that we're already working on that to also think about, for example, presidentialism that can enhance the likelihood both of autocratizers or both of parties being more anti-pluralist and of autocratization taking place. So we're already working on that here. Let me also conclude by just saying that all the data I've been using here is on our website, free of charge. We even have some online tools where you can make graphs easily. We have our democracy report there as well. And hopefully the work I just presented will be there in January also as a working paper. So that's that. I'm very much looking forward to the discussion. And thanks again for listening to me.
Thank you very much. That was very interesting. I think you can, when people are preparing a question, let me ask you a quick clarification question, clarificatory question. Towards the end there, when you were going to the results, I missed, there must have been something about how strong the results are. I mean, there must be, because I mean, you can get results, but are they weak or strong, or how strong was the correlations you got?
Yeah, so basically in the models that we used and also in the way that our methodology prefers to interpret them, you basically look at the strength of the plot, the way they're calculated. They don't give like this what we're typically looking at, the beta value or the statistical significance, the p-value. Because as you've seen on these plots, maybe let me maybe to illustrate that quickly share those again 1 second, because then it's easier to explain. So basically, yes. So basically, what you can see here is that the slope let's maybe go to this one. So that what you can see here in the model with the intersection, you can with the multiple variables included, what you can basically see is that the slope starts increasing sort of at medium to high values of the anti-pluralism scale. That's where sort of, if you would look at it traditionally, where you would have like a larger beta value than at the earlier level. So you can basically see that the increase in populism from sort of in anti-pluralism sort of from being 100% pluralistic to only being deviating from that a little bit. That doesn't make any difference on the results, but then changes, so to say, from the medium range to the highest range. This is when we see differences. And here also, this dot here is the Republican Party in the United States, and you basically see, this is here the 0 line. So you basically see no relationship here for populism, for the cultural dimension, and from the economic left-right dimension. So this is the way to interpret these models. I've run the same models because I'm a bit more with using simple OLS variables in simple OLS models, and I basically got strong statistical significance for this index of anti-pluralism and a very strong value on average. But I think it's more relevant, like how we do it here, to sort of show to show exactly on which level of the scale we see what kind of effect.
Thank you. So then we have a question from Göran Dus Otterström.
Thanks a lot for a very interesting talk. I like the last question you had was whether it should be called illiberal or anti-pluralist. I just want to report my hunch, which is that I think illiberalism is better. And I think that liberalism sounds better to me for the reason that I'm now going to explain. So this is a comment, and it's basically a question about controlling for whether anti-pluralism is empirically correct or not. So here's the thought. It seems to me like the defining thing about anti-pluralism was that you posited as a political party that there was like this unity of interests in society. But then it seems to me like that's always going to be false, right? Because there's not going to be unity of interest, but there's going to be more or less unity of interest. So you think about the political party running an anti-pluralist election in Sweden in the 1950s is going to be a lesser threat than a party running on an anti-pluralist platform now, today. So the question is whether then anti-pluralism, the probability of engaging in these anti-democratic policies is going to be importantly mediated by what society looks like and how pluralistic is society. So if you have a reasonably non-pluralist society, then the predicted probability of anti-democratic action is going to be less. So the question is, do you control for whether that's the case or not, the degree of pluralism in society? Maybe you said something about that, but I missed the part about what you control for there.
Do I respond directly or?
Yes, directly.
Yes? Okay.
Go for it.
Great. No, of course. Well, thanks, Göran. Yeah, that's an interesting thought. I hadn't thought about it that way, that there is sort of a temporal change, but I'm not really sure. I mean, you're thinking about pluralism in a society now, like probably like sort of like how, I don't know, like how the societies have become less cultural homogeneous now, or European societies, right? But I mean, first of all, you also have to think about that this is a project that captures the whole world, so we shouldn't only think about how sort of our societies in Europe or in the West have changed. And then secondly, I would argue, I mean, sort of anti-pluralism in the sense that we talk about here also means, for example, mediating any kind of conflict of interest between workers and factory owners, right? It would basically sort of say, or between rich people and poor people, right? It basically says that this party, or that it's possible to represent a party, and it's possible to represent a people without going through this complicated process of the formulation of political opinions through political parties, through trade unions, through interest groups, through the media, so that there can be a direct link between the leaders and the people. So in that sense, it also reminds a bit about sort of the strategies that totalitarian leaders have used, right? I mean, this is now like sort of at the very extreme end of it. But so that's how we're thinking about the anti-pluralism, and then But the illiberalism, don't you share the concern that illiberalism or liberalism as such is such a huge issue?
Well, maybe. I mean, for the purposes of how you get reported in newspapers, and maybe I would worry about that. Otherwise, I think that you can stipulate whatever terms you want. I think I just have an inclination for that stipulation. Now, the substantive question is that I agree with you that unity of interests was never the case. Like, and this is why it was always associated with fascism, basically, if you want to get into the history of ideas. There is this unity of interest, but it doesn't seem true that there's going to be equal disunity of interest. So it seems like running an anti-pluralist platform would constitute a greater threat in some countries or others, depending on the degree of pluralism in society. So it seems like anti-pluralism, after the Dayton Agreement in Bosnia, for example, an anti-pluralist party there would clearly be more of a threat to rights and constitutional protections and so forth than Norway in the 1950s. So I accept that if you're going for like a dichotomy, so you're saying that this unity is never the case. So if you run on an anti-pluralist platform, then you are more likely to engage in the stuff on your dependent variable. But somehow it seems like the expected threat is going to be greater. It's a really diverse society, and you're rejecting that.
Yeah. No, I mean, we control for this partially. We control for time trend. We also control sort of for the level of democratic institutions, right? So if the argument is that in a country with relatively weak democratic institutions, anti-pluralism is going to be more of a threat, we control for that. Yeah. So, but great, thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, so then the next question is from Stefan Aurora Jonsson.
Yeah, hi, great. Thank you, very interesting. As you see from, within parentheses, I'm not a political scientist, so this question will probably be maybe a little bit left field for you here. But one of the things I took with me from your presentation was that you were talking about an early warning system. And what do you actually mean by that? Early warning for whom? For the people in a democracy who are about to vote, or for the EU when it comes to whether they should have trade agreements with this country, or who is the warning system for?
All of these. Yeah. So mainly to our voters, actually. I mean, that's what I had more in mind. No, that we can. That is sort of like because I remember like before the Trump election in 2016, a lot of people were saying, well, maybe he's just talking. Maybe he's just using this rhetoric to also like this encouragement of violence, for instance. Maybe that's just like a way to sort of get his base behind him and these kind of things. But then we actually saw he continued to use this kind of style also to undermine democratic norms while he was in power, not to like in a super extreme extent because the institutions were also strong enough to contain him. But still, I think it could be helpful sort of to have this like an empirical test of this idea that what leaders say before an election or what political leaders and parties say before an election can tell us something about the risk that they're actually going to be a threat afterwards. And with us, I mean the general public. I mean, I haven't thought too much about the education actually, to be honest, because I also just find it very, also from an academic perspective. I mean, this has been out in the literature, that this litmus test from Linz since the 1970s, and was like a very big idea out there and has never ever been tested. So that's sort of like the first motivation also.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's really interesting, but as far as I understand, the VDEM method is that you use what you call coding by experts, right? Isn't it so?
Yes.
Country expert. So wouldn't they? I mean, the reason why you use experts and not people off the street is that the experts are supposed to have a greater or deeper understanding of something than the average person.
Mm-hmm.
So what I'm getting at here is that, is it problematic for the idea of having an early warning system for, the masses or whatever, to have the signs coded by people who you expect would know more than the average person?
Right. So yeah, I mean, this is a really good question. I've been so focused on sort of doing this research and getting to the stage that I haven't thought too much about this next step now, because of course, sort of also from a practical perspective, like what we've done here now is sort of an ex post endeavor, right? So they have, the experts have now folded sort of going back in time, and for this to really be an early warning system, one would have to devise a strategy for coming up with these indicators like while the process is ongoing, right? And for that, like my colleague here at the Wiener Institute, Merz, has been working a lot with analyzing speeches directly. So she has basically for these kind of illiberal anti-pluralist traits, she has a dictionary to analyze speeches. And I think that sort of could then be more like the actual or early warning system, because that's something that can be done, and that then civic education, for example, could educate the general public. If you hear a political leader saying this or that, you should be alarmed, right? So this is sort of like how I think this could be done, and maybe for this specific paper we need to tone down this early warning thing a bit more, sort of like more the motivation why we want to do this research, to provide some sort of groundwork for this, for an application then in the future. Yeah. So I think something more needs to be done there.
We have a
Great, thanks.
Yeah, we have a follow-up from Tim, I think.
The question was just that it would make sense to have a warning system intended for the voters if you thought that there was a causal relationship between these sorts of behaviors that you see in candidates and the erosion of democracy. But I thought you were saying you weren't making claims about causality. I don't know, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, actually, I think because for an early warning system to happen, you don't necessarily have to have a claim about causality. No, I mean the famous example here is this cannery in the coal mine, right? So they used to, as far as I know, I'm not an expert on this, but as far as I know, they used to use at least cannery bursts, right, in coal mines to detect when some dangerous gas would come out, yeah, and then they would, I guess they would stop singing. I guess that's how it worked, right? So, and then when they stopped singing, the workers knew they had to leave immediately before they themselves would breathe in this gas. So, and these canneries didn't cause the gas leakage, but they signaled that it was there, right? And I think for an early warning system to work, we can be agnostic about causality. We just need to know that if we see a trait, that something else is likely to occur in the future, no matter if there's a causal relationship between it. But I see. I also think that there is a causal relationship.
Okay. I thought the point would be that if the voters got the message, then they could do something to prevent the erosion of democracy. So that's what I meant when I was talking about the causal relationship.
Right. But then here you have to factor in sort of that in order for this causal relationship to happen, of course, the party needs to win the office. If voters would do something about it, and then then of course.
Thanks.
Yeah, it's really tricky. I mean, that's like one of the areas of this paper where we still have room to work on, because it's a tricky discussion, because from my perspective, it's already like this cannery the coal mine argument is already sort of enough to make this important, but then I'm very sure that it's actually these parties then that are driving it, right? If Fidesz would not be in power, then there wouldn't be autocratization in Hungary, or there would be another party in power with similar traits, something like this, then it could also happen. But by the standards that are now applied in political science, unfortunately with the methods we use, we can't really sort of prove causality, but we can only sort of say that it seems likely to us. So.
Thanks.
Thank you.
I have a follow-up question too, but more to Stefan's question, and maybe you went through this very clearly in the talk, but it's about this country expert, and how do you measure the commitment to the democratic process? So, did I understand correct? There's kind of different statements made by the political parties, and then the country experts are interpreting them in a certain way?
Yes. Exactly. Let me open our code book then, so that you get an understanding of what the country experts are doing. A second. Basically, what we show our country experts, we don't really tell them what sources or methods exactly they have to use, but rather we work with a very clear Likert scale that they have to make a judgment on where the country stands. I'll just show you here, the question. Wait, yeah, I'll zoom in and then share my screen. 1 second. The technology. We can really be happy that this pandemic didn't happen like 10 years ago, right? Then we wouldn't do any of this. Always have to be positive. So, where is my... Right, here we go. So you see now the question as we've shown it to the coders. So we basically, or the experts, so we basically ask them, for example, here, to what extent does the leadership of this party explicitly discourage the use of violence against domestic opponents? Then we define also what domestic opponents is. And then we give them here this clear Likert scale of saying 0 encourages, leaders of this party often encourage the use of violence, going via 2 discourages about half of the time, and 4 then consistently discourages, leaders of this party occasionally consistently reject the use of violence against its domestic political opponents. So, so this is what the country experts see, and then they are asked to use the sources that they need to use or their general knowledge about the country to then code this.
Why I ask because, as you know, some parties that are considered populist and things like that, what they are complaining about, and they might be even correct, that they think there's still a little responsivity in the system, that things are not reacting enough on what people's political preferences are. And there's these studies about how there seems to be a kind of big gap between for example, the economic views of the majority and what kind of legislation that goes through. So I wonder, so if these parties are arguing for more kind of direct democracy, more referendums and more things like that, is that a commitment, or does that decrease the commitment to the democratic system or no change?
No, it shouldn't, because that's why we ask the experts these very, very specific questions, right? So we don't ask the experts, would you say this party is committed to democratic norms? Because then we really don't know what the experts think about. I think maybe you want to change the camera perspective again. Yeah, because if we would just ask them, for example, also how democratic is this country, right? Then we don't know what the experts actually think about, what they think is democratic. Some experts might think referenda of direct democracy is democratic, others don't, right? And that's why we ask them always these very, very specific questions that we then aggregate to our indicators. And for example, here, as I said, the anti-pluralism, the lacking commitment to democratic norms, those were these four very, very specific questions, like the rejection of violence. This was the question on respect of minority rights, the question on respect for free and fair elections with multiple parties, freedom of speech, media, assembly, and association. So that even here, if a party now would say, "Oh, we need more referenda," they wouldn't or shouldn't score lower here on this question. Same also with the respect and the personal attacks or demonization against their opponents. We have, and that's also why we have this separated out, this commitment to true democratic normative core indicators from the people's centrism that, for example, populist parties might exhibit. So that would be a question on the party leadership always glorifies and identifies with the ordinary people, which they claim to represent, for example. So we really try to separate that out also in VDEM proper, not in the party data set.
Thanks. So then we go to a question by Sangeeta Bhagagupta.
Yeah, thank you. Can you hear me?
Very well.
Yes. So actually, you've been peppering your responses to the earlier questions, to the question I had put in the chat at some point at the beginning of your presentation, and this is related to what kind of baseline idea are you working with that constitutes democracy, and particularly the democratically functioning leaders? And I say this because you have been pointing towards different issues, but this seems to be kind of the elephant in the room. Let me give you a couple of examples that I have noted. One is, I didn't hear you ever talk about representativity of the population in the leadership of these parties, for instance. And a second point that I just thought of was political correctness in terms of what they say. So how they account for, how these experts are accounting for their responses.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And I can also say that I have a multidisciplinary background. I'm not a political scientist, yes.
Okay, great. No, this is a great question. And so there are three ways I can answer to this. One is the VDEM perspective as an institute. The second one is my personal perspective. And the third one is the perspective we take in this paper. So all three are a little bit different. So let me maybe start with the VDEM perspective, right? So in general, at VDEM, I sort of try to bring that up already in my answer to the last question, right? We're called varieties of democracy. That means that sort of from our inception, we don't make a very clear statement of what is a democracy, but rather we say there are different varieties of democracy. Our job here is to present a database of more than 300 indicators on all these different aspects of democracy. And then actually you as a researcher or as an interested member of the public, you can come and take the indicators and aggregate it to whatever aspect or whatever concept of democracy you have. We have, for example, in there a lot of indicators on representativity, on, for example, the share of women represented in positions of power, also on diversity in terms of a broad range of other issues. So this is something that can be included in democracy measures, building on VDEM. That's like sort of the first point. The second point here in this paper, we basically use when we speak of a democracy. So when we say a country is democratic or is autocratic or is moving away from democracy towards autocracy, we use one of the most prominent concepts in political science on this by Dahl, who spoke about polyarchy, right? And who said that a country, in order to be democratic, needs to have clean elections, needs to have freedom of association, freedom of speech, yes, and universal suffrage, of course. and those positions of power need to be determined by these electoral processes, not, for example, by the military. So this is sort of a definition of democracy that remains relatively silent on the concept, on the issues of who is actually represented, but it's more sort of a procedural idea of that the procedure should be free and fair to then bring people into these positions of power. That's sort of what we do here. It's sort of like the one of the standard concepts in political science. If you ask me personally, some of you might know I also have a background in the Green Party, and I'm actually running for office again in Germany, just sort of as a disclaimer, but I try to separate my political work out from that, and definitely also William's work. I would definitely say a country becomes more democratic the more diverse also representation is. And that needs to be taken into account. So 3 different answers to your question. I don't know if that was.
Could I follow up myself with? Thank you for that.
Absolutely.
You mentioned something about level of democratization of institutions in one of your earlier responses to another question, and I wonder how is that operationalized in your study?
Yes, it's also based on Dahl's concept, right? So it's basically we have I think something like 25 indicators or so to operationalize this idea of first of all the clean elections, so that means that there are no irregularities, that there's no violence in the elections, that votes are counted fairly, and all these things. So a range of electoral indicators. Then a range of indicators on freedom of association that talk about that civil society groups should be able to be organized freely, that they shouldn't be repressed, and as such. That also there should be opposition parties should be allowed and be free to operate, and then thirdly the freedom of expression and speech, where it should be clear that there's a plurality of sources of information by the media, that media is not censored, and these kind of discussions, and then of course universal suffrage.
Yeah. Good. Next one is from Joe. Oh, you can get my microphone.
Okay, thank you. So my question is about the data gathering process. I'm not familiar with VDEM or with your work. So you've mentioned before that there are these experts, that they're providing some of this data. So could you say a little bit more about who they are, what it means to be a country expert? And then there's another question I want to ask once I know this.
Okay, yeah, sure. Now the country experts are really sort of our most important resource, right? We have enlisted about 3,000 of them. And they are typically academics, so they have a PhD and they're affiliated with an academic institution, and also typically live in the country that they're working on, or have expertise, for example, through publishing a lot on this country, and also on the specific topic in that country. So we have work on such a big realm of issues. So with the parties, we also have something on academic freedom, we have the elections, the judiciary. These are separate surveys, and for which we have separate expert clusters as well. And and we sort of, when we recruit those experts, we try to make sure that they're not affiliated with the government and also independent elsewise. And then our sort of post data collection process, we also try to see if there are any, like what we call fraudulent coders. We had some cases where people basically only signed up for the money, so they gave us like super random scores. So we tried to eliminate that. And then we had somebody who either didn't get it, or I don't know what happened there. We call him our Stalinist coder, or it could also be a woman. who basically said that Russia was sort of, on all dimensions, most democratic during the Stalin time. And our Bayesian measurement model actually recognizes if somebody deviates so much from the other experts on the country, and then this person is automatically, the influence of that person is automatically rated down. So that's sort of, so the recruitment is important, but then also we have a range of sort of post-data collection processes that help us to ensure data quality.
Okay, thanks. So the reason I asked this question was precisely because I wanted to inquire about whether the political views of the people who are the experts might influence and how they might be screened out. So to take a sort of controversial example that I wouldn't endorse, Americans, there's a lot of discourse about saying that in the United States, academia is a sort of liberal bastion. Academics are far to the left of the median American. And so what do you say to someone who says, well, your whole process is going to now be invested in some sense with the political views of these experts? I guess it would come down in a way to what the questions are and to the extent to which those questions would elicit or screen off the political views of the experts. So how do you think about that?
Yeah, that's exactly how we're trying to address that. We're trying to formulate our questions in a way that they don't tap into the political views of the experts. Like there's no question on, do you think this head of state is particularly competent or not? This is like not a kind of question we would ask, but it is sort of on a set of indicators where something specific is asked. For example, did this person encourage violence? And where sort of later the normative part, we try to keep it then sort of post-data collection, where we can say, okay, this is now an indication of anti-pluralism. You see what I mean? So this is definitely this is the way we have been working with it, and this is, I think, also works fairly reasonable. If you look at the data, for example, that I showed you before, maybe I could show you again on the Republicans. If it was true that sort of the data is completely biased by our experts being more lefty than the general population, then also the Republicans should have scored very high sort of on these indicators that many of us would normatively consider bad already from the beginning. But that's not what we're seeing on the data, but rather what we're seeing is a temporal development, right? So we see basically, if we aggregate these indicators on anti-pluralism, we see here that our coders have coded the Republican Party very close to the median ruling party in democracies. And so I think for me, this is an indication that the way we ask the questions really manages to overcome these biases a bit. The same also for these other parties, the ruling parties in other countries. Fidesz, you also see this development over time. And if you would say, okay, these were anti-Fidesz activists coding this, then they should have been biased enough already to rate them sort of higher on this already from before. Having said that, of course, there's no way we can sort of completely get rid of any potential bias here. Another way where we're trying to address this, of course, by working with typically 4, normally in the big VDEM survey it's more 5 experts. So then we can also already see that there, that's what we get them towards the median score here. And
Okay, thanks. So can I ask one more thing that's not about this evaluative question, so I'm satisfied with that. But now I'm just curious about the historical data. So you had certain data points for some of the questions that were going back to 1970. So are these asking experts now to look back at statements that were made? I guess, is it just, are they historians? Like, to what extent do we trust their judgments about what was happening in 1970?
Right. No, of course. This has limitations. I think for the party in particular, we only went back to 1970. In the regular VDEM data set, we went back to 1900. We even have data going back to the French Revolution. But for the data from sort of the French Revolution to 1900, we have indeed worked with historians. So this was then like also a different method. It was basically one historian who was paid to actually go to the archives and really sort of code this alone. But we think that the experts, and also like a lot of like the validation exercises that we've done, that the experts, for example, an expert on elections in a certain country typically also has some idea about how this has developed in the history of over the last 100 years. I could, for example, I think easily code the questions on Germany for elections, with like going back then to some historic resources. That's sort of what we encouraged the experts to do. When it comes to the parties, also 1970s, I think for political scientists who work with quantitative data, that's what we have to do, right? We have to go back a bit in a time series to get any kind of statistical power. So people have been thinking about the past, and as I said, I've been looking into this also like in terms of face validity quite a lot, and it seems to make sense with sort of the more qualitative evidence we have from these time periods, but probably it's a little less nuanced than the more recent data. That's what I would say.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you.
But I think now it sounds like you only rely on data from contra expert, but you have hard fact data too. Turnout in voters and things like that. It's not judgments only by contra experts.
Well, actually, I think the data we rely on mainly for this kind of analysis is from the expert, because like voter turnout, for example, is so difficult to interpret. Like, what does it mean? In some countries, in some countries like Belgium, we have compulsory voting. In some really authoritarian countries, also like from what I know, for example, from Eastern Germany, right? People, when it was under dictatorship, people were really sort of like had to go to vote, right? In some countries like the US, you historically have very low levels of electoral participation. So there are actually a lot of studies that show us that the voter turnout has very limited Aussagekraft would be the German word. That basically from voter turnout we can't infer much on the quality of the democratic process. So that's why, and actually I wanted that also to say that to your earlier question here on sort of the biasness of the experts. That's the whole point why VDEM exists and why we've also attracted so much funding, because the sort of hard data on the political process has so many limits. For like the example you've probably heard from Stefan Lindberg is that if we, for example, count the number of journalists in jail, we end up with the same number for North Korea and for Sweden. Yeah. But for Sweden, it's because simply the government doesn't put journalists in jail for their reporting. And in North Korea, it's because the media is so restricted that we don't have independent journalists that could even dare to say something that the government would not like, right? So that's exactly the reason why we have gone on this endeavor, because the things that really matter in the political process are not really susceptible to actual data collection, unfortunately.
Then we have the next question from Christer Byqvist.
Can you hear me?
Very well.
Good. Yeah, so actually I had technical problems here. So I got disconnected. When I was connected back, I heard Joe asking my question. But I didn't hear your whole answer. But let me perhaps do a follow-up. So you talked about the fact that if there were sort of bias, it would have shown earlier. But we also know, of course, that is polarization being developed in the last 20 years, right? So couldn't that explain that, they used to be closer, the right and the left in the US 20 years ago, but now it's very, very polarized, and you interpret the other side in a different way, consequently. And you see what they say as attacks on the certain norms where you would, and so on the other side as well.
Yeah, but then, yeah, I mean, definitely there is more polarization, and definitely, and it's a nice idea to think about how that might increase biases in these voting processes. But on the other hand, so for example, our data on the UK, clearly shows that for the last, or not clearly, sort of in our data for the UK, the experts suggest that Johnson and Corbyn during the last electoral campaign have used demonization of their opponents, or sort of portrayed them as illegitimate. And now, of course, the interesting question is sort of, maybe one of them was actually right to do so, because one of them might be really a threat for the democratic process and the other one not. But sort of the experts have portrayed both of them as using this technique. And I would argue that the UK has become quite polarized now recently, more than it used to be, at least, maybe not as much as the US. So I think we see that here. And when it comes to the US case, really, I spoke, I don't know if you heard that, I spoke before about my colleague Serafin Merz, who actually in this case now uses sort of hard data to look at very similar indicators, namely just at the speeches of candidates. And you can basically, I mean, for each of these four aspects that we looked at, you find, and in the written paper I also give that, you find actually papers that you find statements from Trump that support that. So it's not something that the experts just made up. I mean, just to remind you, right? So prior to this election, to what extent was the leadership of this party clearly committed to free and fair elections with multiple party freedom of speech? I mean, already before the 2016 election, Trump has not clearly committed to accepting the electoral outcome, right? So not clearly committed here. Then severe personal attacks or tactics of demonization, 2016 election, think about how he spoke about Clinton. I think that was clearly on a different level than how Clinton spoke about Trump. The same for implementation of the will of the majority, even if doing so would violate the rights of minorities. Here we also have quotes from Trump from 2016 that write this out here. And I think the encouragement of violence, we all have the examples in head where he basically said, I'll cover your legal fees if you beat up opponents, right? So yes, there has been polarization. Yes, that might have led experts to be sort of, if they lean on the Democratic side, to be more skeptical of Republicans. But I think still the coding here is defensible.
But as you said now, I mean, these are more objective measures just mentioned, right?
Right.
Which we can rely on, and I think are really good, actually. So in many cases, we don't need to ask the experts about this, exactly. Frequencies of using words or not, or the absences of using certain words, right?
Exactly.
So can't we develop those of more objective measures instead, or yes, complement this research with those? And
exactly. That's exactly what my colleague Serafin Merz is doing. She's developing the speech corpus. But this has limitations, of course, of going back in time, right? Because speeches from like the 70s, 80s are not readily available here. And also going to different languages. Yeah? So this is very, very cost intensive. She's writing grant applications for this, but sort of right now, I think she's covering, I'm not sure, but definitely much less than the 166 countries that we were able to cover with the experts. But this is definitely like a way this should go. So this is really, and indeed also contrary maybe to other VDEM indicators, this is actually like the speeches before an election. This is actually something where factual data exists, but it's sort of just the collection of it is very resource intensive, let's say, put it that way.
So happy with that, Christer? Good. So actually next on the list is, I have a question, but it's a rather small question, but it's interesting. So I think in the beginning, you said you were using this liberal democracy index, But if I remember correctly, it's a couple of years since there are a number of other indices available at VDEM. So I just wondered if you looked at this kind of results in the light of some of the other indices, and if that would change your results.
So in terms of the global trend of autocratization, yes, we've also looked at the other indices. Just to remind you, the Liberal Democracy Index is composed of the liberal parts of democracy, which is the constraints on the executive by the parliament and the judiciary and the rule of law, as well as this electoral democracy index that I've already, I've spoken a lot about. There is this Darwinian concept of elections in a context of free associations and speech. So both of these ones clearly exhibit these downward trends in the recent years. The other one that clearly also exhibits this is the deliberative index that we have. That's sort of, and this is really something that's also the only indicator, by the way, that has been going down in Sweden also. Or one of the components is the only indicator that has been going down in Sweden. Which is related to the effect for political opponents in the political debate, and I can look it up which one exactly was the one that had been going down in Sweden, and factfulness, the use of facts in the political debate. So this is also this whole, it's related to polarization, but it's also related to this massive spread of disinformation that we see and the use of emotions in the political debate. This has been going down when it comes to participatory parts of democracy. So particularly local democracy has actually improved in many countries in recent years. Like in Oman, they have introduced now local elections. I mean, this is some good news. And the other one with egalitarianism has unfortunately also slightly only gone down when it comes to sort of also to what extent income matters for political access to political power. So so it's a general trend, and in our democracy reports typically we also look at the other parts of democracy. So it was a small question but a big answer.
Yeah. Just to follow up, I mean, is any of these, because you dismissed before that you thought that this kind of voter turnout is completely uninteresting, but I think some of these indices you have has that as a component. So
no, we measure voter turnout. We have the data on voter turnout, but we don't put voter turnout in any index. No.
So any index. So if everybody stops voting in a country, that doesn't change the degree of democracy. No one goes and votes. Well, that seems strange.
Yeah,
I don't think that's true.
But that's a little unrealistic. No, I mean that's.
Yeah, that's just a simplification. I mean, as many people in political theory at least will say that voter turnout says something. I mean, it's very, very low, or if it goes up. For example, some people have said that one positive effect of polarization, or maybe the entrance of this populist parties, is actually voter turnout have gone up. In Sweden, we've been worried about voter turnout being going down. And I don't think people are confused being worried about that, but you think so. But I also thought it would be strange if the indices none of these are sensitive to this. That would be news to me.
Right, but yeah, I totally see your point. And again, from the debates that we're having in Europe, in Sweden, but also in Germany, your view makes a lot of sense. And if I would build a democracy index only for Europe, I think I would think about including voter turnout. But we're capturing here the whole world and also sort of the authoritarian regime spectrum, right? Where often governments force their people to show up at the ballot box with very illegitimate means, right? So sort of what we have, that's one of the challenges of the VDEM project, that all our measures sort of have to have the same meaning wherever in the world. And there I would argue that issues like freedom and fairness of elections, constraints for opposition parties, or the question if you have opposition politicians in jail, for example, that matters more. But I would totally agree that if I would do an analysis of let's say, the health of democracy in Western Europe, I would totally look also at journal, and indeed that it's a positive thing that this has gone up now recently. Yes. Yeah.
Okay, then we have more time for questions actually. And Sangreta, you want to ask a question again?
Yeah.
Very welcome.
So I don't know much about the VDEM Institute, and I was looking at the homepage, and there are different data sets. So I wanted to comment on that, because what is data? Is something you've been discussing, and you say that hard data has many limitations, but aren't there other kinds of data? You spoke about some speech data, which I'm particularly interested in. So could you point to that on your homepage?
Yeah.
And the different languages? How are you dealing with, in this kind of data that you're in any case working with, how are these country experts communicating with you? Is everything in English or what?
Yeah, so unfortunately the speech corpuses I was talking about, that's a project of my colleague Serafine Merz at the moment, and I think she has not made the data on the baseline for that available at the moment, because she's still sort of her own project, and it's not, she's not at the stage yet where this will be released, but I hope it will come out at some point. When it comes to communication with the country experts, we offer, I mean, typically sort of the day-to-day. Well, so we have most of the communication, particularly so the coding interface, which is the important thing, where the website where they enter their ratings. This is available in 4 languages, I believe. So in English, in Spanish, in French, in Russian, and I believe also in Portuguese. So it must be 5 languages then. We had an Arabic version at the beginning, but then it turned out that very few coders actually used that Arabic version, and then we switched that to English as well. And also sort of the regular, the automatized communication with them is also in these languages. So we have sort of the regular emails to them also in those languages. And if need be, if they need to, we have some staff that speaks Russian and French, Spanish, and these things. So yeah. And we also offer secure communication for the experts, because for some of them, this is really personal security issues. So we have some secure lines and boxes and these things.
Do you see the possibility of other kinds of, you might call that microscalar data that has relevance to what you're doing? I can point towards a new study that my colleagues and I just published in the International Journal of Higher Education, where we, as ethnographers, we normally don't study web pages, but we looked at 55 web pages of universities and adult educational institutions for high schools in the Swedish landscape. And we were trying to understand how discrimination, the Swedish discrimination law, gets operationalized in the accounts that universities give. And then we went one step further. We looked at how individuals who are deaf or who are blind and newly arrived immigrants, how they access the support that these 55 institutions make available or say they make available. And it was and we report on a rather very problematic picture that emerges. So I'm trying to understand how the VDEM institution is doing this very global, large-scale work, but how can one connect in order to understand issues of democracy?
Yeah, so basically, I think it's this is like a very valuable strand of research to look at these micro-level instances, acts of communication. As I said, my colleague is doing that a lot. I'm not really sure how much of that can sort of be standardized to fit, for example, our data collection approach in terms of how we communicate. So as you might have seen also on the website, for example, there's graphing tools and things that are hopefully easy enough for anyone to use. Also, we have a project here, for example, in Göteborg with the World Culture Museum, where they have used our data as part of their exhibition, and where we've just applied for a new project together with them, where they want to develop some pedagogical tools, how also the communication can be simplified, so that this could even be used in high schools for civic education. I don't know if that really answers your question, but that's what came to my mind.
Yeah, I'm just trying to probe, because data can mean a number of different things. Could you share the name of your colleague who is working on the speech data in the chat, maybe?
Sure.
Good. We have a follow-up question here to this by Evelyn Torre.
I've been thinking a lot about what is the key indicators of quality in compulsory schooling regarding the manufacturing of democracy. And it was a bit spin-off from what Sangeeta was talking about. And especially if we're talking about Europe, I'm working as a teacher myself. There's a lot of talk about which country has the best school systems. Sweden is much better democracy than France, and blah blah blah. And I'm also thinking a lot about the multidimensional poverty indexes regarding bias when you actually vote. And I've also read reports, mainly from Sweden, about how the main bias for a voter is actually our parents. People tend to vote a lot like their parents did.
I don't.
You know. So do you have any indicators of the quality or the role of compulsory schooling? I mean, especially regarding like those 4 key indicators of illiberal. What was that again? The low commitment to the democratic process, the demonization of political opponents, encouragement of political violence, disrespect for minority rights. School has a key role, but are there any indexing in this system for us to look on? Yeah,
so indeed, we have actually asked our experts also to think about that. So we have, let me just pull that up. We have in the regular VDEM data set, we have a battery of questions that my colleague John Gehring has developed on equality. But here in this area, I would actually say that there are a lot of also sort of hard data that can be used, but nevertheless ours might be able to complement here. Let me just find it. Equality, yes, here. So we have basically asked the experts to think about, for example, is political power distributed according to socioeconomic position? Yeah. So thinking about whether wealthy people have no more political power than those whose economic status is average or poor, or wealthy people enjoy virtually a monopoly on political power. So that's something that they have been thinking about, also according to social group, according by gender, according by sexual orientation. And then we have a question here on educational inequality or equality that basically asks to what extent, I can maybe share the screen, it actually works quite nicely. Yes, if you can see my screen now, so there's this indicator that might be relevant for you here. educational equality. So to what extent is a high quality basic education guaranteed to all sufficient to enable them to exercise their basic rights as adult citizens?
So this is like the, what is that, social development index?
Yeah, this is like an index that the coders have been asked to assess, and on our website you can also access this indicator.
Thank you.
Yes, I can also post it in the chat, maybe the question.
Okay, Evelyn, you satisfied with the answer?
Yes, thanks.
Very good. Okay, then we have a question from Tore Vincent Olsen.
Yes, can you hear me?
Very well. Welcome.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Yeah, so I work at the Department of Political Science at Aarhus University in Denmark. So thank you for a very nice presentation. I'm working together with some colleagues on a project where we're trying to figure out how democracy can defend itself against sort of populist undermining of liberal institutions. So it's very related to what you're looking at here. I really appreciate sort of the work with the concepts you have with sort of illiberalism versus populism, and I think you had some good points there. So I was picking up something you said early on in your presentation where, and the sound wasn't too good, so maybe I misunderstood it, but I think you said that some of the cases of sort of the development towards autocratization were stopped, and I think you mentioned something about 18%. Does that ring a bell?
But yeah, so 80% were stopped. Sorry, no, other way around. 80% led to the breakdown of democracy, and 20% not. And of these 20%, also a share of them is still ongoing. This is a result of a paper of my colleagues also. I can post the link to the paper also in the chat. You can read it up sort of. But it sort of illustrates that we often get on this slippery slope, like once the process starts, it actually leads to the breakdown then also of democratic institutions.
Yeah. Okay. So that's very interesting. Do you have any sort of idea what might stop the process from deteriorating into autocracy?
Yeah, excellent question. I'm currently editing a special issue for Democratization for the journal, which asks exactly this question. So on the resilience of democracies. And the paper that I'm going to share here now that I just sort of quoted from my colleagues is part of that special issue. And I have a qualitative paper, which is sort of a bit fresh ground for me here in that special issue as well, where we ask, or hopefully it's not fully through the peer review yet, but where we ask exactly that question. We look at 3 cases where autocratization has stopped. And these 3 cases are Ecuador after Moreno, it is South Korea, where these huge mass protests forced the president to be indicted, forced the parliament to indict the president, and then also Benin. And in all these 3 cases, basically what we've seen is that something has happened over time where that changed the power balance between the autocratizer in power and the opposition. So in the case of Ecuador, it was an economic crisis. In the case of South Korea, it was a public uproar about a big corruption and power abuse scandal. In the case of Benin, it was actually the constitutional time limit for the president, and he didn't feel powerful enough to circumvent that time limit as several other people can do it, right? So it's basically it's sort of like a factor in the economic political environment or in the institutional environment that changes, that then helps what we call in this paper accountability actors to actually stop this process. However, I mean, that's also why we worked on this qualitatively. The cases are really it's a very small number of cases, yeah. So we haven't had that much experience. A lot of the cases that are ongoing, like in Poland and Hungary, I hope also at some point they will be stopped. I think the US hopefully has stopped now with Biden coming to power, so there was then the electoral mobilization. Yeah, but it's unfortunately more likely than not that it actually stopped. That it actually.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Very informative.
Very good.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. That'd be great.
So on that note, I think we are coming towards the end of this talk and this discussion. So it was lovely. Thank you very much, Anna. And this is the last seminar of the term, so I welcome you all back. So I have no new seminars to announce, and I welcome you back in around the 20th of January. We are starting up again. And you're all welcome back then in whatever form we do it, but probably it will be something like this. It will definitely be accessible in this way, but we might also have the speakers here if the pandemic situation improves. But thank you very much for this term, and I thank again Anna for this lovely talk and discussion. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for the invitation. Happy to answer any more questions via email or such.
Excellent. Thanks a lot.
Bye.